It seems like this is something deeply rooted in human DNA. We collectively condemn it, and we all know it only brings sorrow and suffering, but we always find a cause which justifies our reasoning to start a new fight. We never learn from past events, and now, the Middle East once again finds itself under the spotlight. The tragic dance between Hamas and Israel isn't just a regional conflict. It's a potential blockbuster that could leave the global economy in tatters. And that risk is very real, as Israel's army is invading Gaza in response to an attack by the militant group. The death toll from the Hamas assault and the ongoing Israeli airstrikes on Gaza is already in the thousands. There's serious concern that militias in Lebanon and Syria that support Hamas will join the fighting in greater numbers. A sharper escalation could bring Israel into direct conflict with Iran, a supplier of arms and money to Hamas, which the US and the European Union have designated a terrorist group. In that scenario, Bloomberg Economics estimates oil prices could soar to $150 a barrel and global growth drop to 1.7%. A recession that takes about $1 trillion off world output. Conflict in the Middle East can send tremors through the world because the region is a crucial supplier of energy and a key shipping passageway. The Arab-Israeli War of 1973, which led to an oil embargo and years of stagflation in industrial economies, is the clearest example. Other conflicts had a more limited impact, even when the human toll was high. Today's world economy is extremely vulnerable. We are still suffering from the inflation exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. Another war in an energy-producing region could increase this inflation. Broader consequences could extend from renewed unrest in the Arab world to next year's presidential election in the US, where gasoline prices are key to voter sentiment. All of these potential effects depend on how the war develops over the coming weeks or months. Economics has examined the likely impact on global growth and inflation under 3 scenarios. In the first, hostilities remain largely confined to Gaza and Israel. In the second, the conflict spills over to neighboring countries like Lebanon and Syria, which host powerful Tehran-backed militias, and essentially turning it into a proxy war between Israel and Iran. The third involves escalation into a direct military exchange between the 2 regional enemies. In all these cases, the direction is the same. More expensive oil, higher inflation, and slower growth, but only the magnitude is different. The wider the conflict spreads, the more its impact becomes global rather than regional. Of course, the actual range of risks and possibilities is wider and more complex than these scenarios can capture, but none of them are positive. Even narrow economic chains of cause and effect have proved difficult to forecast amid the volatility of recent years, and wars are always hard to predict if you are not in the inner circle of the so-called leaders. Still, the scenarios we map out here should at least help to frame thinking about the potential paths ahead. Scenario 1. Conflict confined to Gaza. In 2014, the kidnap and murder of 3 Israelis by Hamas was the trigger for a ground invasion of Gaza that left more than 2,000 people dead. Fighting didn't spread beyond the Palestinian territory, so its impact on oil prices and the global economy was muted. However, the past week's death toll is already much higher on both sides. Still, one possible trajectory for the current conflict would essentially be a replay of that tragic story, combined with tighter enforcement of United States sanctions on Iran's oil. Tehran has increased its oil output by as much as 700,000 barrels per day this year, as prisoner exchanges and unfreezing of assets signaled a thaw in relations with the U.S. If those barrels disappear under United States pressure, Bloomberg Economics estimates a $3 to $4 boost to oil prices. The impact on the global economy under this scenario would be minimal, especially if Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates offset lost Iranian barrels using their spare capacity. Scenario 2. Proxy war. What if it does spread? Hezbollah, an Iran-backed political party and militia that's a powerful player in Lebanon, has already exchanged fire with Israeli forces on the border and said it hit several Israeli army posts with guided missiles. If the conflict spreads to Lebanon and Syria, where Iran also supports armed groups, it would effectively turn into a proxy war between Iran and Israel, and the economic cost would rise. Only time will tell, but if Hezbollah joins the campaign, the timing could be after the beginning or during the ground operations in Gaza. Escalation on these lines would raise the probability of a direct conflict between Israel and Iran, sending oil prices much higher. In a short but bloody Israel-Hezbollah war of 2006, crude jumped by $5 a barrel. On top of the shock from the confined war scenario, an equivalent move today would send the price up 10% to about $94. Tensions will rise in the wider region. Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia are all mired in economic and political stagnation. In the region, a repeat of the Arab Spring, a wave of protest and rebellion that toppled governments in the early 2010s isn't unthinkable. But Israel's response to Hamas's attack has also triggered protests in a lot of Western countries. On the streets, the distance from anti-Israel marches to anti-government unrest is short. It might become the straw that breaks the camel's back. The global economic impact in this scenario comes from two shocks: a 10% jump in oil prices and a risk-off move in financial markets. Higher oil prices would also add about 0.2 percentage points to global inflation, holding it near 6% and sustaining pressure on central bankers to keep monetary policy tight, even as growth disappoints. To put it simple, if you thought your life was already expensive, this will make it all a lot worse. Scenario 3. Iran-Israel war. Direct conflict between Iran and Israel is a low-probability scenario, but nonetheless a very dangerous one. It could be the trigger for a global recession. Soaring oil prices and plunging risk assets would deal a substantial blow to growth and take inflation a notch higher. No one in the region, not even Iran, wants to see the Hamas-Israel conflict escalate into an all-out regional war. But that doesn't mean it won't happen, especially with emotions running high. The possibility of miscalculations are large. Israel has long viewed Iran's nuclear ambitions as an existential threat. Tehran's moves to build a military alliance with Russia, restore diplomatic ties with Saudi Arabia, and smooth relations with the United States have added to unease. Israel and the United States have sent mixed messages about Iran's complicity in the Hamas attack. In an Israel-Iran confrontation, Tehran would likely seek to activate its entire network of proxies and partners in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Bahrain. It would have a long list of hard and soft Western targets in the region to choose from. In this scenario, increased superpower tensions would add to the volatile mix. The United States is a close ally of Israel, while China and Russia have been deepening ties with Iran. Western officials say they're concerned that China and Russia will exploit the conflict to divert attention and military resources from other parts of the world. With around a fifth of the world's oil supply coming from the Gulf region, prices would skyrocket. A repeat of the strike on Aramco facilities by pro-Iranian militants in 2019, which took almost half of Saudi oil supply offline, isn't out of the question. The price of crude might not quadruple as it did in 1973, when Arab states imposed an embargo in retaliation for United States support for Israel in that year's war. But if Israel and Iran are firing missiles at each other, oil prices could increase in line with what happened after Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait. With a much higher starting point today, a spike of this magnitude could take oil to $150 per barrel. The spare production capacity in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates may not save the day if Iran decides to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's daily oil supplies pass. There also is a more extreme risk-off shift in financial markets. Plugging in those numbers, Bloomberg economics model predicts a 1 percentage point drop in global growth, taking the number for 2024 down to 1.7%. However, world recessions are always tough to define. The rapid expansion of economies like China means outright contractions are rare, but 1.7% would meet the criteria. Unfortunately, the conclusion is that the Middle East, once again, could become a troublesome disruptor, upsetting the already very fragile balance of the world economy. And for us, the onlookers, there is nothing more we can do than to hold our breath and watch. Will this be the turning point that dismantles our economic stability, or merely another episode in the ongoing drama of global politics? As the stage is set for this mix of tragedy and comedy, we prepare for the inevitable twist, hoping it won't plunge us into an even further economic despair.